She wouldn't leave. Not for food, not for shelter, not even when the storms rolled in and the nights dropped below freezing. The wild Mustang stood vigil beside the small grave, day after day, unmoving. At first, the family thought it was just coincidence. But what they discovered buried beneath that frozen earth, and who the horse truly was, shattered everything they thought they knew about love, memory, and what it means to never forget. This isn't just a story about loss. It's about a bond that even death couldn't break. The fog hung low over Shiloh Valley that morning, thick, heavy and slow to lift, like grief with no place to go. Crows stirred on the fence posts, restless, and down by the chapel, the frost hadn't yet broken. Everything held its breath in that kind of silence only winter understands. Clem Dorsey had been up since before dawn, checking fence lines like he had every morning for 37 years. His hands were stiff on the reins, eyes narrowed against the cold. But when he crested the rise above the chapel and looked down toward the small cemetery that edged the trees, something made him stop. At first, he thought it was just another shadow caught in the mist. The shape didn't move, didn't flick an ear, didn't turn its head, just stood there. Still. Clem squinted. The shape had lines, deliberate ones, shoulders, withers, a flowing tail that the wind occasionally lifted but never shifted from its post. A horse, he muttered. But there were no horses turned out this close to the chapel, and certainly no reason for a lone one to be standing dead center in the cemetery. He dismounted, boots crunching in the frost, and walked down the slope. The closer he got, the more surreal it became. It was a Mustang. Black as coal, muscles tense beneath a dusting of ice, legs locked like she was guarding something. Her eyes tracked him, slow and unblinking. She didn't flinch. He stopped 20 feet away. "Easy, girl," he said out loud, raising a gloved hand in instinct. "Ain't nobody here but me." Still she didn't move. Not an inch. Clem followed her gaze down, and that's when he saw it. The grave marker at her hooves. A fresh one, still ringed by frozen flowers. Micah Calloway. Born 2013, died 2023. Our brightest light. Clem felt a tightness grip his throat. He remembered the accident. Everyone did. The boy's death had shaken the valley, sharp and sudden like a window shattering in a quiet house. But no one mentioned a horse. He took one more step. The Mustang pinned her ears and gave a single warning stomp. The message was clear. "This is my place. Don't come closer." Clem backed up slowly, never turning his back on her. The fog had begun to lift now, curling off the grass like breath from the earth itself. He reached the top of the rise again and turned back. She was still there, unmoving, watching. The chapel bell rang in the distance, one long, low chime. Clem tipped his hat and whispered into the cold, "Well, I'll be damned." Because whatever this was, it wasn't just grief, it was loyalty. And something else too, something the valley hadn't yet begun to understand. By the second morning, word had spread. Someone had posted a photo, blurry and distant, of a black Mustang standing in the cemetery, like a statue carved from smoke and muscle. The caption just said, "Still there." By noon, a few cars lined the edge of the chapel road, their tires sinking quietly into the snow-softened dirt. No one spoke loud. They stood at a distance, coats buttoned tight, breath ghosting in the air, as they watched the animal that wouldn't move. The Mustang stood exactly where she had the day before. No rope, no fence, no food, just standing. As if the ground beneath her hooves mattered more than anything else. It was Ellen Calloway who stepped from the last car, her fingers white-knuckled around a thermos she wasn't drinking from. Her husband, David, followed behind her, jaw set, face hollow. Micah's older sister, Emma, stayed in the car. They didn't need to ask which grave the horse was guarding. Micah's was the only one new enough to wear grief, like a fresh coat of paint. Tiny stuffed animals were half buried in frost at the headstone. A scarf he used to wear still hung on the shepherd's hook nearby, swaying gently in the wind, like he might come get it any minute. Ellen stood there in stunned silence, the Mustang barely a dozen feet away. Their eyes met. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why her?" The Mustang flicked an ear, but didn't move. David finally said it out loud. "She's over his grave." A murmur rippled through the others gathered, neighbors, townsfolk, even Pastor Jonah. People shifted, unsure of what to make of it. "She's not just passing through," someone said. "She hasn't eaten," another added. 3 days now, still the Mustang didn't flinch. Her ribs had begun to show through her winter coat. Snow dusted her back, like she'd stopped caring about the cold. But her eyes never left the boy's grave. "Should we call someone?" Ellen asked, her voice paper-thin. "Animal control. Called 'em already." Clem Dorsey replied, stepping up beside her. "They came this morning, tried to herd her off. And she came right back. First chance she got." Ellen covered her mouth with one hand, the thermos forgotten. David cleared his throat, emotion thickening his voice. "You think Micah knew her?" Silence. Then Pastor Jonah stepped forward. "I've seen a lot of strange things in my time," he said gently. "But grief recognizes grief, even across species." The Mustang lowered her head slightly, as if acknowledging the words. Emma finally got out of the car and walked up beside her mother. She didn't say anything, she just looked, and in that long, unbroken moment, something settled over them. A feeling no one could name yet. Not fear, not coincidence. Something deeper, something waiting to be remembered. The truck pulled up just after dawn, tires crunching over frost-bitten gravel. 2 men stepped out, both in county jackets, both already rubbing their hands against the cold. Animal control had come prepared. Hay, grain, even a padded lasso tucked discreetly under the tarp. The Mustang didn't blink. She was still there, still standing over the grave, like it was hallowed ground. Like she belonged there more than the headstone itself. "She hasn't moved all night?" one of the officers asked. "Not a step," Clem replied, arms folded tight across his chest. Stood through the wind like a statue. The first attempt was simple, laying down a trail of alfalfa cubes from the grave to the paddock gate, maybe 50 yards away. The scent carried fast, sweet and tempting. They all waited. Nothing. The Mustang's nostrils flared, her ears twitched, but her legs never shifted. Next came the grain bucket. The kind that rattles just right, like memory in a tin can. The officer shook it gently. She turned her head toward him, just barely. He took a cautious step forward, shaking the bucket again. When he got within 20 feet, the Mustang reared, not high, not wild, just enough to say, "This is your last warning." Then she screamed, a deep, ragged cry, half rage, half sorrow, that echoed off the chapel walls and made everyone freeze. They circled her wide, used their poles and practiced steps, trying to push her toward the open gate. It might have worked on another horse, but not her. She lashed out with hooves like steel, spun faster than a mare her size had any right to. One of the men stumbled backward into the snow, breath knocked out of him. Still, she didn't run. She didn't bolt. She turned, walked back. one step at a time, back to the grave. She stood again, head bowed, like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just fought off the world for the right to stay. The officers looked at each other, then at Clem. "Call us when she tires out," one of them said, "or drops." But she didn't, even as her flanks began to hollow, even as the wind picked up and the frost came harder, even as the food sat untouched at the edge of the cemetery. She stayed. Ellen came later that afternoon, bringing with her Micah's scarf and a thermos of warm water. She didn't speak, just stood at the fence, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "She's starving," she whispered. But the Mustang didn't look at the water, didn't sniff the scarf. She only watched the grave, and in that gaze, unyielding, infinite, was a promise Ellen could feel in her chest like thunder. "I'm not leaving him. Not now. Not ever." The room still smelled like him. Not strong, just hints. Soap, pine shavings, the worn flannel he'd refused to stop wearing. Ellen stood in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame, like she was asking permission to enter a world that had stopped spinning 3 weeks ago. Micah's boots were still by the bed, laces tangled, his jacket draped over the chair. A plastic model horse sat mid-gallop on the shelf, its leg broken, just like it had been for months. She hadn't had the heart to fix it. She moved to his desk, fingers trailing over the clutter he'd left behind. Marbles, a chewed pencil, a folded piece of gum wrapper that held no secrets anymore. Then she saw it, a small leather-bound book wedged between 2 sketch pads. Brown worn, the corners soft from use. She didn't remember buying it for him, didn't remember ever seeing it at all. Her hands shook as she opened it. The first page held only one word, written in Micah's careful block letters: midnight. She turned the next page. A sketch, rough but full of feeling. A black horse, mane flying, eyes wide and alert. Page after page followed. Horses in motion, horses grazing. One curled down asleep beside a boy who looked an awful lot like Micah. Every image was labeled the same: midnight. She kept flipping. Then the sketches stopped. The pages turned to words, letters. "Dear Midnight, you came back today. I left you 2 apples but you only ate 1. That's okay. I saved the other core in my pocket, just in case you want it later. Dear Midnight, I told Emma you're real, but she laughed. I don't blame her. You're too good to be true. Dear Midnight, sometimes I think you're magic. You come when I need you. You listen better than anyone. You don't talk, but you understand. I wish you could come home with me." Ellen had to sit. Her knees gave out gently, and she let herself sink onto the edge of the bed, journal open in her lap. She kept reading. There were entries about where he saw her, by the old cottonwood near the canyon trail, behind the broken fence post where the wildflowers grew. There were lists of the food he brought, the sounds she made, the dreams he had after seeing her. Then one final page. "Dear Midnight, if anything ever happens to me, don't be scared. I'll be okay. You'll find me. You always do." Tears fell silently onto the paper, softening the ink until it bled into the page. Ellen held the journal to her chest, eyes closed, as if the boy who once wrote those words might somehow still be in the room. Outside, the wind shifted, and though she couldn't see the grave from here, she knew without a doubt. The Mustang had found him, just like he knew she would. The barn still creaked like it always had, timbers groaning with each gust of wind, like they too remembered things they hadn't told anyone. Ellen stood just inside the wide doors, arms wrapped tight around herself, her breath clouding in the dim morning light. She hadn't come to look for answers. Not exactly. She just needed to be near something of Micah's that felt true. That's when she heard the voice behind her. Knew he wasn't making it up. She turned. Henry Tate stood by the saddle wall, his cap pulled low over his grizzled face, a pitchfork resting loosely in one call-used hand. He'd worked the ranch longer than anyone else, knew every fence post by memory, every gate by sound. And he'd always had a soft spot for Micah, even when the boy's curiosity got in the way of chores. "What do you mean?" Ellen asked, stepping closer. Henry didn't look at her, just stared at the empty stall where Micah used to sneak treats to the barn cats. He used to talk about a black Mustang. Said she followed him from the canyon. Said she'd wait by the cottonwood while he fed her pieces of apple from his coat pocket. Ellen's heart thudded. "I told him he was just dreaming," Henry went on, voice low. "Told him wild horses don't do that. Not with kids. Not with anyone. Thought maybe it was his imagination. You know how quiet he was, how he saw things different." Ellen nodded slowly, the weight of the journal still fresh in her memory. "But he kept telling me, month after month. Said he never touched her, just sat real still and let her come close. Said she didn't act like the other ones, that she watched him even when she thought he wasn't looking." Henry finally turned to face her. He named her Midnight. Said he'd never heard a sound from her. Never a whinny, not even a snort. But she looked at him like she knew. Ellen covered her mouth with one trembling hand. "You believe him now," she whispered. Henry's jaw clenched. "I saw her with my own eyes standing over that grave. Doesn't take a genius to know she ain't just some random stray." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a cracked horseshoe, its edges rusted, the nails still bent where it had once been pulled from a hoof. "Micah gave me this last spring. Said she dropped it near the trail. Said it was his secret." Ellen took it in both hands, staring down at the cold metal, at the dirt still clinging to its curve. "He was right," she said, her voice breaking. Henry nodded. Boy made a friend. World just didn't believe him in time. They stood in silence for a long while, the barn creaking around them, the truth finally settling like dust on old wood, quiet, certain, and impossible to ignore. The sedative took longer than expected. Dr. Laura Penner stood just outside the chapel fence, watching the Mustang with quiet precision. She'd mixed the lowest dose possible, just enough to bring her down for a few minutes. It felt wrong, even with the vet's oath, but the mare was losing weight fast, her flanks sunken, her coat dulled beneath layers of frost and sorrow. "She's not gonna like it," Laura muttered. "She hasn't liked much of anything," murmured Clem beside her, fingers clenching the dart gun. The Mustang had stayed over the grave for 10 days now. No food, no shelter, just wind, snow, and the carved name of a boy she refused to leave. The dart found its mark in the shoulder. The Mustang jolted, let out a soft grunt, and then stood stiff as stone for nearly 3 minutes before her legs began to wobble. She didn't fall. She sank slow, like she was folding into herself, until her body came to rest just beside the headstone. "She's down," Laura said. "Go." They moved fast. No rope, no halter, just hands and breath, and time counted in heartbeats. Laura knelt beside her, running gloved hands along the Mustang's side. Ribs sharp as fence rails, hooves cracked and chipped from the cold. But her heart beat strong, her lungs clear. "She's tougher than most," Laura murmured. Then her fingers stopped at the base of the Mustang's neck. "What's that?" Clem asked. Laura leaned in, brushing away a layer of crusted hair. There, buried under months of winter coat, was a faded leather strap, An old halter, nearly swallowed by the mare's own fur. A tiny brass tag hung from it, dulled by time and ice. Laura wiped it clean with her sleeve and read aloud midnight. If found, return to MC Silence. Micah Calloway, Clem said hoarsely. MC. Laura swallowed hard, running her fingers over the letters again. He tagged her, she said, and she kept it. All this time. Ellen arrived moments later, breathless, eyes wide. Someone must have called her. She dropped to her knees the second she saw the tag, covering her mouth with both hands. I thought he made her up, she whispered. A dream, a story. I never even asked where he went after school. Laura gently placed the tag in her palm. He didn't make her up. He named her. The Mustang's breathing was slow but steady. Her body curled toward the grave like she couldn't help it, even sedated. She came back, Ellen whispered, tears spilling fast now. She found him. The sedative would wear off in minutes, but the truth would last much longer. Beneath the fading winter sun, the town finally understood. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was a reunion. One the boy had prepared for, and the horse had never forgotten. The envelope was light. Too light, Ellen thought, for something that now felt so heavy. She sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling as she slid the photos out. 24 glossy prints from Micah's old disposable camera. The one he'd carried everywhere, the one she found under his bed weeks after the funeral, half used and buried beneath a pile of comic books and balled-up socks. She'd almost thrown it away, but something had told her to get it developed. A whisper from somewhere deeper than memory. Now the truth spilled across the wood grain, one photo at a time. Snow, trees, the ridge behind the cottonwood trail, and then, there, him, Micah, his hair wild beneath a knit cap, his cheeks flushed from cold and joy, and underneath him, clear as breath on a mirror, was her, Midnight. No saddle, no bridle, just a boy and a Mustang, moving together like they'd done it for years. Ellen gasped. Her hand flew to her chest. The next photo showed him lying back against her neck, his arms stretched wide, laughing, laughing. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen that look on his face in real life. Around people, he'd been quiet, careful, like he was always bracing for the next misunderstanding, the next question he couldn't answer fast enough. But in these pictures, he looked free, effortless, seen. She flipped to the next one. Midnight grazing while Micah crouched beside her, sketch pad in hand. His fingers were smudged with pencil. He was looking at her, not through a lens, not posed, just looking, like she was his secret, and he hers. Ellen's eyes blurred with tears. She pressed a photo to her chest, as if it might let her feel the heat of that moment. David entered the kitchen quietly, sensing the weight in the air. He stopped when he saw the photos, his breath hitching in his throat. That's, he started. She nodded. It's her. It's always been her. They spread the pictures out like puzzle pieces, every shot a glimpse into a world Micah had kept sacred. The canyon trail, the cottonwood, the tiny stream he'd once called their watering hole, places he'd spoken of only vaguely, as if naming them too clearly might make them disappear. But they were real. All of it was real. David picked up one image, Micah holding on tight as Midnight reared slightly, her mane catching the sunlight like a flame. You ever seen him look like that? He asked softly. Ellen shook her head, voice barely a whisper. No, not once. The wind rattled the window pane. Outside, down in the cemetery, the Mustang still stood, guarding, waiting. And now, with the proof in their hands, Ellen understood something that broke and mended her heart all at once. Micah hadn't just loved her. He belonged to her. and she had always known where to find him. The room felt colder now, though the heater hummed softly in the corner. Afternoon light filtered through the curtains in quiet gold, catching on dust motes that drifted like thoughts too light to hold. Ellen sat on Micah's bed, the photos spread in her lap, the journal open beside her. His handwriting danced across the pages, so careful, so deliberate. Like every word was being whispered to someone who couldn't speak back. She ran her fingers over a sketch of the two of them, Micah and Midnight, curled side by side under a starlit sky. Her son had drawn the stars with tiny white dots, like they mattered, like they were watching. She didn't realize she was crying until the first sob slipped out, quiet and sharp. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't see it." She had been there every day, packing lunches, reminding him to wear his gloves, worrying over homework and medication, and the way he never quite fit in at school. She'd sat across from him at the dinner table, asking questions he never really answered, watching his eyes drift to the window like they were tracking something far beyond the walls of that house. And she thought she'd known him, but it wasn't her who knew what made him light up. It wasn't her who calmed him when the world felt too loud. It was a horse, a wild Mustang no one else had believed was real. He told her once, in passing, "Some things don't need words, Mum." She'd nodded, distracted, pouring coffee, rushing to fold laundry before the day got away. Now she understood. The silence he'd shared with Midnight hadn't been empty. It had been sacred, whole, complete, and she had missed it. She covered her face with both hands, tears soaking through the edges of her sleeves. Guilt settled heavy in her chest, familiar, unwelcome but undeniable. "I was right here," she whispered to the room, "and I didn't see you." Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the window. From this side of the house, she couldn't see the cemetery, but she didn't need to. She knew Midnight was still there. She could feel it, like the Mustang's presence had carved a space in their lives that would never quite close again. David found her there an hour later, curled around the photos, the journal pressed to her chest like a lifeline. "I should have known," she told him through tears. He was happiest with her. Not me. Not us. Her. David knelt beside her, his voice breaking as he said, "Maybe we didn't need to be everything. Maybe it was enough that someone was." She nodded, the truth settling like snowfall. Micah had found his place, not in a classroom, not in the crowd, but in a clearing beside a Mustang, and she'd stayed, even when he couldn't. The scream tore through the stillness like a blade. It wasn't the wind, wasn't coyotes, wasn't anything that belonged to the natural rhythm of the valley. It was deeper, raw, and guttural, a sound born of something ancient and urgent. Ellen shot upright in bed, her heart already pounding before her feet hit the floor. "Did you hear?" she started, but David was already throwing on his coat. They met Emma in the hallway, pale and barefoot, clutching Micah's scarf in both hands. No one spoke. They just moved, through the kitchen, out the back door, across the frozen yard. Midnight's cry came again, but this time it was different. Shorter, sharper, like alarm. She stood at the grave's edge, head high, body tense, nostrils flared. Her hooves danced on the hard earth, pawing at the frost, like she was trying to wake it. The family rushed closer, breath billowing out in clouds, boots crunching over the brittle grass. "Something's wrong," David said. Midnight screamed again and reared, hooves slicing the air before landing hard, right at the foot of the grave. The ground gave a soft shudder beneath her weight. And then, a sound, low, wet, breaking. Emma gasped. The soil at the center of Micah's grave had begun to collapse, slow at first, then faster, like the earth had decided it couldn't hold the weight of winter anymore. The bouquet of frost-covered flowers tilted sideways, one plush teddy bear falling face first into the hollowing ground. "Oh my God," Ellen whispered. "The frost, it's shifting." David dropped to one knee, brushing snow away with bare hands. The top layer crumbled like stale bread, revealing a crack that split the grave lengthwise. "Ground's giving way," he said. Freeze-thaw cycle must have destabilized the fill. Ellen stared, chest tightening. "Is it? Is he?" "No," David said quickly. "He's okay, but if the collapse gets worse, the coffin could shift. We need to call the funeral home. They'll know how to stabilize it." But none of them moved. Not yet, because midnight was still there, circling the grave now, frantic, wild-eyed, her hooves thudding the earth like a warning drumbeat. "She knew," Ellen murmured. "She felt it before we even saw it." Midnight stopped suddenly, stood still, then gently, deliberately, she lowered her head and placed her nose to the ground, just above where the earth had caved in. It wasn't a gesture of panic. It was a gesture of protection. "She's guarding him," Emma whispered. The wind died down. Snowflakes began to fall, soft and silent, like feathers from something too gentle to name. They stood there in the dim blue light before sunrise, hearts rattled, eyes wide, watching a wild Mustang defend a child buried beneath frozen soil. Not even nature could take him without going through her first. Midnight had warned them, and they had listened. The cemetery was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest instead of your ears. The ground, still half frozen, groaned with each shovel blade. Workers moved carefully, solemn in their duty. This wasn't just maintenance, it was sacred. Ellen stood off to the side, her coat zipped to her chin, hands clenched in the pockets. David stood beside her, one arm wrapped tight around Emma, whose eyes hadn't left the grave since they arrived. Midnight was there too. No rope, no halter, no one had the heart or the nerve to move her. She stood a few yards away, watching every motion, every gesture, her breath rising in soft clouds. She hadn't screamed today. She didn't need to. They all knew why she was there. The head groundskeeper, a soft-spoken man named Curtis, finally stepped forward and knelt beside the collapsed earth. He'd done this before: casket shifts, frost damage, the quiet labor of grief that no one talks about. "We'll be respectful," he said gently. "Promise?" Ellen nodded once. The top layer of soil was lifted away. Then another. The dirt had indeed settled unevenly, pulling one corner of the small coffin downward. Nothing had broken, but stabilization was needed. They uncovered the lid with careful hands. Curtis hesitated. "Do you want a moment?" Ellen didn't speak. She only stepped forward, eyes fixed on the place where her son rested. The lid creaked as it opened, and time folded in on itself. There he was, still, peaceful, the same quiet boy, with the soft hands and solemn eyes, wrapped in the blanket she'd tucked around him with trembling fingers. But her breath caught as she looked at his hands. One was folded over his chest, the other gently curled around something. Curtis leaned in, then paused. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely audible. "There's something here." Ellen dropped to her knees beside him. From beneath Micah's small still fingers lay a thin worn braid of black and silver strands, delicately tied at the ends with a faded strip of leather. "Horsehair," Emma gasped. "That's hers." David's knees gave out slowly, and he crouched beside them. "How?" No one could answer. Ellen reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the braid. It was soft in places, coarse in others. Real, tangled with snowmelt and soil, and something older than words. He brought it with him, she whispered. He must have before he... Her voice cracked, lost in the hush. There were no tears, not at first, just awe, just silence. Because somehow, the boy no one quite understood had chosen to leave this world with a piece of the only one who ever truly saw him. A gift, a promise, a part of her, buried beside him, like it belonged to all along. Midnight stepped forward then, as if summoned not by sound but by feeling. She lowered her head slowly, reverently, and for a moment everyone believed, without doubt, without reason, that she had known. He didn't leave her behind, he took her with him. Snow had melted just enough to let the earth breathe again. Patches of brown grass peeked through like shy witnesses as the townspeople gathered in quiet rows beside the chapel hill. No programs, no organ, no spoken sermon, just boots on thawing ground and eyes that couldn't seem to look away from her. Midnight stood beside Micah's grave, her black coat brushed and brushed again by hands that had once feared her. A simple rope lay slack across her neck, not to tether her, but to show they'd tried to do this with her, not to her. She hadn't moved far since that morning the grave gave way, hadn't wandered, hadn't run. She just stayed, like the words they'd already etched. The stone sat ready. It was small, simple, no dates, no explanation, just 3 words carved with care. She stayed. Pastor Jonah stood nearest the headstone, his Bible clutched at his side but unopened. "I've buried friends," he said, "and I've buried strangers. I've spoken over heroes and over folks who barely made a dent, but I've never spoken over a horse. And still, I don't think words will do her justice." A pause. The wind stirred. Midnight shifted, but did not step away. "She didn't ask to be here," he continued, his voice cracking, "and yet she came. She didn't sign any register, didn't wear black, didn't kneel at an altar, but she mourned. Lord, she mourned. And she reminded us what it looks like to love someone with your whole being." Ellen stood a few feet back, Emma's hand in hers. David placed one palm on her shoulder, steadying her not because she was weak, but because she was made of too much. Beside the little pile of letters and tokens Micah's classmates had left at his grave weeks earlier, someone had added a braid of black hair, bound at the ends with twine. Not a perfect match to the one Micah had taken with him, but close. A symbol, maybe, or an offering. Kids lined the fence, silent for once, hats clutched in small hands. One by one, they came forward and laid something at the base of the new stone. An apple, a drawing, a single wild flower plucked from the thawed field near the trail. Midnight watched, ears soft, eyes calm. She blinked slowly, once, as if she understood the rhythm of what was being offered. When the crowd finally stepped back, and the stone was placed with quiet reverence into the earth beside Micah's, no one clapped. No one needed to, because some eulogies don't need volume, they need presence. And she had given hers. Not for an hour, not for a moment, but for as long as it took. She stayed, and now they would never forget it. The letter came in a plain envelope, tucked between a feed store coupon and an overdue water bill. Ellen almost didn't open it. But she did, standing in the kitchen, the morning sun warming the floor, the silence too loud without Micah's footsteps thumping down the hall. She unfolded the single page and read the words slowly. "To the Calloway family, we've heard about Midnight. We'd be honored to offer her a permanent place at our sanctuary." The rest blurred for a moment. A kind voice, gentle words, a real offer. The Mustang refuge sat just 80 miles north, wide acreage, open hills, a reputation for treating every wild horse like a soul, not a project. Ellen had heard good things. They weren't asking for ownership, just guardianship. She folded the letter carefully and looked out the window. Midnight stood near the far fence line, the frost gone from her coat, her frame still thin but healing. She'd started to graze again, lightly, warily. She didn't come close to the house. She never would. But she was there, not lost, not wild, not tamed either, just present. Emma padded into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She saw the letter in Ellen's hand and asked, "Is it about her?" Ellen nodded. "They want to take her in, keep her safe. Food, vet care, open range, everything she'd need." Emma stared out the window, her gaze following the dark figure by the fence. "She doesn't need us," she said after a while. "She just chose to stay." Ellen felt the truth settle like a stone in her chest. Midnight had lived untethered for years, slipping through canyon brush and moonlight without leaving a trail. She could have disappeared a dozen times since Micah died, but she hadn't. She came. She stayed. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. David found them in the kitchen a moment later and read the letter himself. He set it down gently. "Well," he said, "it's a good place, but I don't know if it's her place." They all turned back to the window. Midnight was staring straight at them. Just for a moment. Just long enough. Ellen stepped closer to the glass and whispered, "She belonged to him, not to us, not to fences or names on papers." Emma reached up and took her mother's hand. "So what do we do?" Ellen didn't answer right away, because the answer wasn't easy. You didn't rescue a horse like Midnight. You released her. And maybe, just maybe, if you were lucky, she came back. The morning sun broke through the clouds like a promise. Down in the open field below the chapel hill, children on horseback lined up 2 by 2, fidgeting with reins, adjusting helmets, some with nervous hands, others with steady resolve. Their coats were mismatched, their boots muddy, but their hearts beat with something bigger than any of them could name. At the front of the line stood Midnight. No bridle, no saddle, just a loose rope held lightly in Emma Calloway's hand, more symbol than restraint. Midnight didn't need direction. She knew the way. The ride had been Emma's idea, whispered one night in the quiet after grief had done its worst. For him, she'd said. For other kids like him. They'd called it the ride for Micah. What started as a few kids on borrowed ponies had grown into something the whole town embraced. Ranchers offered horses. Teachers walked alongside. Parents lined the route with coffee cups and crumpled tissues in their hands. And leading it all was the black Mustang no one had dared to believe in until she believed in them first. Ellen stood near the starting post, one hand over her heart as Pastor Jonah gave a short blessing. There were no speeches, just the steady shuffle of hooves, the soft jingle of stirrups, the occasional sniffle from someone trying not to cry. At the signal, Midnight stepped forward. The line behind her followed like water through a canyon, easy, certain, impossible to stop. They rode through Shiloh Valley, past the school Micah once sat silent in, past the cottonwood trail where he'd met her, past the creek where he'd once drawn a map to nowhere. Along the route, people clapped gently, some pressing hands to lips, others reaching out just to touch the edge of what this had become. Signs along the road bore messages in crayon and marker. "Ride for the quiet ones. You are never alone. Micah's light still rides." When they circled back toward the cemetery hill, the wind picked up, lifting Emma's scarf behind her like a banner. Midnight slowed near the grave, hooves soft against the thawing earth. She paused, looked once, lowered her head, then kept walking. Ellen watched them disappear into the trail beyond the ridge, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the weight of goodbye. She felt motion. Every dollar raised that day went to a youth mental health program named after Micah. Counseling, art therapy, equine healing sessions. The town built something he would have needed, something he had, in a wild, uncatchable form, and every spring after, when the fields began to green, the children rode again, always led by the horse who never needed permission, always riding for the boy who once whispered dreams to the wind, always remembering, some bonds don't end, they echo, and they move us forward. The wind changed with the seasons in Shiloh Valley, but some sounds never quite left. Ellen had grown used to the rhythm of quiet, morning coffee on the porch, birdsong filtering through the cottonwoods, the steady creak of the swing where Emma used to sit, now grown and off at college. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was filled with memory. But sometimes, just before dusk, when the light dipped gold and the air turned soft around the edges, she'd hear it. Hoofbeats. Distant, faint. She'd stop whatever she was doing, stirring soup, folding clothes, thumbing through a book, and tilt her head toward the sound. Not running, just there, like breath, like a story being retold. David had heard it too, more than once. "You think it's her?" he'd ask quietly. Ellen never answered, not with words. She just looked toward the old trail behind the cottonwood and let the ache bloom gently across her chest. Midnight had never been seen with a halter again, never came close to fences or barns, but there were prints, clear ones, in the spring mud near Micah's grave some mornings. And once a single black hair caught on the barbed wire gate where Emma had left an apple out of habit. She never stayed long, but she came. Still, neighbors sometimes asked if they'd thought of claiming her. "She's part of the family," one woman had said. "You ought to keep her safe." But Ellen knew better. You don't keep something like midnight. You accept the gift of her presence when it's given, and you let her go when she chooses. One evening, as dusk folded the valley in lavender light, Ellen stood near the grave, a blanket draped around her shoulders. The small stone that read "She stayed" was worn now, the letters softened by rain and time. She closed her eyes, and there it was again, a breath of wind through bare branches. Then, the sound, hooves, not galloping, just walking. She turned slowly, heart caught somewhere between then and now, but there was only wind, only light, only the whisper of what once was, and somehow still remained. "I hear you," she murmured. "I always will." She placed a fresh drawing by Micah's stone, a new one Emma had sent from school. Midnight and Micah, side by side under a sky of stars. The wind lifted it slightly, then settled it gently back down. Ellen smiled, tears catching in the corners of her eyes. Because grief doesn't disappear, it evolves, it lingers. But love remembers, and sometimes, when the timing is right, and the world stands still enough to listen, it returns, hooves on wind, soul on breath, a Mustang, still watching. The letter was small, folded twice and tucked behind the old dresser they'd meant to move for months. Ellen found it while dusting, her hands pausing on the worn wood just long enough to feel something shift, something too deliberate to be accident. She pulled the dresser gently forward, revealing a yellowed envelope resting in a quiet nest of dust and lint. Her breath caught. It was addressed in Micah's handwriting. "To the person who finds her, if I'm not here anymore." Ellen sat on the edge of the bed before she dared open it. The edges were soft from time, but the ink inside was still clear, steady and careful, like all his letters. If anything ever happens to me, don't be sad too long. I think everyone has one person or one something that understands them best. Mine wasn't a person. Mine was her. Midnight. She doesn't talk, but she listens better than anyone. If you find her, please be kind. She gets scared easy, but she's brave when it counts. She helped me feel brave too. She doesn't belong behind fences, not even the nice ones. She belongs to the wind and the stars, and wherever I go when I'm not here. And if she comes back and stands still for a long time, don't be scared. That just means she knows where I am. Love, Micah. By the time Ellen finished reading, her hands were trembling. She pressed the paper gently to her lips, then to her heart. Outside, the afternoon sun poured over the fence line, gilding the grass in soft gold. Midnight hadn't been seen in weeks. Not since the last ride for Micah. But Ellen didn't feel panic. Not anymore. She walked the letter out to the hill and laid it at the base of the stone where both their names now lived, his, carved in marble, and hers etched beside it in soft humility. A few hours later, David found her there, sitting in the grass, her eyes closed, her lips moving like prayer. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. He left a map. We just didn't know how to read it. He sat beside her, arm brushing hers. They stayed like that until the sun kissed the valley edge. And then, hooves. Not loud, not near, just the faintest rhythm on the wind. Ellen smiled. "She's checking in," she said. David didn't ask how she knew, because some things aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be felt. The Mustang had always known, even when no one else believed, even when the boy grew silent, even when the world moved on. She had known where to go, and now they did too. Because love, once given freely, never truly disappears. It just waits, and watches, and sometimes walks back on four quiet legs to remind us we were never alone. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours, don't let it end here. If to share it with someone who still believes in the quiet power of loyalty, memory, and the bonds we can't explain. Leave a comment below if you believe Midnight stayed not out of duty, but out of love. And if you've ever felt seen by an animal when the world couldn't hear you, this story is yours too. Subscribe for more true and powerful stories like this.